If you start with the trajectory of Trump, and even before that, the Tea Party, starting in 2009, and the kind of insurgency inside of the Republican Party that the Tea Party started, takes out Eric Cantor in 2014 and others, and then Trump comes along and kind of picks up the torch. So I think, one, it's tempting to look back, or to look right now at Trump and conservatives and the Republicans and the Tea Party, and to put it all in one bucket and say they're all this way and they're all alike. But we have to understand that first, Trump actually waged an open insurgency within the Republican Party against the establishment. They tried very hard to stop him. He took out one coronated candidate after another in 2016 in the primary, and that insurgency was critically important for him to win over certain pockets of disaffected, especially working class, some rural voters that were done with politics, were done with both parties. So having that open fight with the political establishment, even though there was no substance to it, it was like drain the swamp. The optics of that kind of establishing himself as an outsider, and you can look at it and be like, well, that's bullshit. He's a billionaire, he's part of all this. But in terms of optics and style, he established himself as an outsider, and part of it was the reaction of the establishment party. So that was very important to winning over those bases. Then, as president, first term and later, he has consolidated complete control over the Republican Party. And so now, in some ways, it's more fair to cast the whole thing in the same light, because everybody who disagrees with Trump, mostly inside the Republican Party, is mostly quiet about it. You start to see some breaks right now, some cracks, which I'll come back to. But not only that, between 2016 and 2024, not only did he consolidate control of the Republican Party, he continued to expand his base. Now, he bled out some of the more affluent suburban swing voters that the Democratic Party, unfortunately, in my opinion, prioritized. It worked to some extent. The Democrats prioritized these affluent suburban swing voters and won some of them through those efforts and through their general disgust with Trump, et cetera. But in the meantime, that strategy one for Democrats of prioritizing those affluent, suburban, highly educated voters, that is what lost them the 2016 election. While Democrats were doing that, prioritizing that base of voters, it lost them the election in 2016. It won them the election in 2018. Generally, they took back the House, won Biden the White House in 2020, and that combined with Roe versus Wade being overturned in 2022, they did pretty well. But all the while, they were bleeding out more and more working class voters. And at first it was almost entirely white working class voters, but it started to cut into Black and Latino working class voters too. Not the majority of Black and Latino working class voters, but more and more significant swaths of those voters. So Trump and the Republican Party, stylizing themselves as the party of the working class, won over more and more of those voters through pretty sophisticated, voter outreach techniques and ads and everything. And the Democratic Party was useless and not even, there was a memo in 2021 after the Republicans lost the White House that said, yeah, we lost the White House, but look at this bleed of white, Black, Latino, Asian working class voters. If we can increase this, we're gonna continue to define ourselves as the party of the working class, and define the Democratic Party as the party of the elites. So they were both consolidated, Trump both consolidated control internally of the Republican Party and expanded the base going into 2025 or 2024 election, won the 2024 election. Now the question is, since then, 2025, 2026, there are cracks now. There are cracks that we shouldn't underestimate, but we shouldn't overestimate either. Because there is a very, very solid, very consolidated base, 34 to 37% of the electorate that, is just full Trump. It's, in some ways like a cult, right? That it's very hard to disrupt. But there are certain things that Trump did. I think the two biggest, I don't know if they're missteps, but they're costly decisions that he made that is losing segments of that coalition. and especially those working class voters that he won over between 2020 and 2024. Like, he's losing a lot of those folks in the polls. Younger men between the ages of 19 and 29 or whatever. And those two things, one is coming out of the gates in 2025 with the inauguration, having Musk and Bezos and these billionaires behind him, and giving the keys of the kingdom over to Musk, the richest man in the world. Not very populist. Trump's populism was always fake, was always the pseudo-populism that invokes people's anger at concentrated wealth, but doesn't make concentrated wealth the problem and quickly pivots away from that. But that's undermined by making Musk so visibly, and Bezos so visibly in it. So that hurts him with some working class voters. And then this year, Iran. This is a disaster for Trump. And both in terms of, there's evidence that in 2016 that Trump's electoral win, it came down to lots of things, but one of the things it came down to, there was something like 1.5% of the voters voted because of the Iraq War, because they were so mad at both parties for that, and saw Trump as being opposed to foreign interventions and et cetera. And so he's undermining his credibility. With that was very important to a good segment of voters. And then you combine that with the fact that it's what it's doing to the economy, what it's doing to inflation, what it's doing to gas prices. And there's not that many people whose blinders are functioning anymore. There's still a base, right? But there's people who are like, fuck this. Neoliberalism and the crisis of neoliberalism, the failure of our economic institutions and our political institutions that have been doing their bidding to hold anybody accountable, say in the U.S. for the global financial meltdown, the financial meltdown and the foreclosure crisis in 2008, to act effectively during the COVID pandemic, to have government be a effective advocate for people and to stop the worst from happening. We're in this institutional crisis, and both parties are responsible for it. Trump understood that popular anger, and did this kind of bait and switch, went after the cultural elites as a way of appearing to punch up while also punching down at vulnerable scapegoats, immigrants, trans people in the last election. And his favorite targets are in this cultural elite: the media, Hollywood, academia, Democratic Party politicians. But the Democratic Party played into the strategy by just being beside themselves at somebody like Trump. In 2016, I was going around saying this guy is probably going to win if we don't stop him. His path is through the Rust Belt states. Myself and the people in my organization had a memo that we were mapping it, and the Democratic Party people that we were going to were like, oh no, it's good that Trump is running because he can't possibly win. And the condescension and, we all know the basket of deplorables moment with Hillary Clinton. They played into this, both, they were behind these policies. They embraced the free trade agenda. They embraced neoliberalism. They did more welfare reform in Bill Clinton in the 90s than Reagan ever dreamed of. They were complicit with Iraq and the war authorization votes and under George W. Bush's administration, and bombed Iraq and did economic sanctions under Clinton. So, there was no opposition party for years, and both parties deservedly were branded as being out of touch with everyday working people, failing everyday working people, not holding anybody accountable for the financial crisis, for millions of Americans losing their homes. And Trump did this distance from the establishment, this kind of stylistic blowing it up. And the Democrats not only refused to do that, but did everything they could to circle the wagons to stop the most popular hope of doing that, which was Bernie Sanders. Here's an argument you can make that if the establishment party is failing so badly, then why aren't the insurgents running circles around them, right? Well, there's some answers to that. One is Democrats are very bad right now at running against Trumpist, pseudo-populist authoritarians, because they're running with an establishment narrative, and that establishment, the status quo, is not popular. But they're very good in primaries, in Democratic primaries, at stopping the insurgents. And part of that is that candidates like Bernie Sanders are bringing in disaffected voters. Often they're not registered as Democrats, so they can't vote in the primaries. So there's this added job, this lift of registering new voters. So primaries are hard. They're hard to win, and there's a resource asymmetry. And not only that, look, the left in the United States, 15 years ago, it's starting to change again, but 15 years ago was at the tail end of this 40-year period of decline, of labor unions in decline and under attack, just the rise of individualism and the lack of people being part of collective vehicles. And so we have this kind of race against time to relearn these skills of political campaigning, political acumen, basic skills of democracy, how to organize organizations, right? And that's been happening, and very successfully in pockets, right? And even though Bernie Sanders lost in 2016 and 2020, his campaign did operate as a massive kind of training ground for operatives, for volunteers, for leaders, and that's the same with a lot of these congressional campaigns. So we've been winning. We've been picking up ground. The squad, AOC, et cetera, has expanded. This year it's set to probably expand much more, because organically there's a lot more candidates. It's crossed a certain threshold where there's a lot more candidates. Let me say it this way: the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, which is, and there's a Senate equivalent that is supposed to give strategy and resource for candidates for winning their elections, it has lost credibility. 2024 was a massive loss of credibility. 2016 was some, but people could still be like, well, this is an anomaly. 2024, Trump winning again. And then people see somebody like Mamdani win, and they see somebody like Graham Plattner and the momentum he has, and that he is likely going to beat Susan Collins. And they see the DNC telling them how to run a campaign, and they see these guys, and they're like, it's a mismatch, and they're not listening to the DNC anymore. Some people still are, but the insurgency in the Democratic Party has expanded, not just to leftists, but to, I think, some politicians who are just, wanting to be a successful politician and are finally seeing, like, oh, if I want to win, I have to speak to working people. I have to name culprits. I have to talk about billionaires and how the economy's been rigged. I have to stand up for labor unions, right? So it's becoming finally more of a common sense. It's still insurgent. It's not the common sense, but I think we are crossing a threshold right now. I think populism it belongs to the left. And historically, this is true, right? Populism as a term was coined by the movement in the 1880s and 1890s in the United States, an agrarian redistributionist movement that took aim at concentrated wealth and political power and sought to redistribute it, right? So authoritarian pseudo-populists is what I call people like Trump. They understand a populist moment. A populist moment is when the establishment, the people in charge, they're failing, there's an institutional crisis, there's an opportunity to re-articulate political affinities and the narrative of who is we the people and what are the threats to that. And they understand the power in the populist rhetoric, and they hijack that form. And so the way that they hijack that form is they invoke anger at concentrated wealth and power, but they quickly pivot away from it, and they pivot toward targeting elitism, cultural elitism. Generally people in the top 20% of the economic spectrum, not the 1%, not the 0.1%, but people with educational privilege, Democratic Party politicians, the media, Hollywood, academia. And it works for a number of reasons. One, it works because a lot of people are resigned about the economy. They're like, it's like the weather, what can we do about it? But condescension of, affluent people, people like Hillary Clinton saying basket of deplorables, people see red. And when you're in the bottom 80% looking up and you see the top 20%, that looks kind of like the top from your vantage point, even though there is a much more concentrated, enemy and threat at the top. And then it really works because when the opposition party, the Democratic Party, which has not been a very good opposition party, consistently refuses to name a more convincing culprit, people's lives are not going well. They want to understand who is to blame. They have an intuitive sense that it's these fuckers at the top. And if your opposition party is saying, let's return to the status quo, and is not articulating those culprits, then that creates a vacuum that people like Trump have been able to fill. We know from polling, I mean, Center for Working Class Politics has done a lot of polling, other people have shown this, that when we name those culprits at the top, they are more convincing culprits than racialized scapegoats, than the xenophobic narrative. You don't win over everybody, but you win the majority you need to win a majority. And it's not only that the Democratic Party is failing to do that consistently. When people like Mamdani, when people like Bernie Sanders and AOC do this, the Democratic Party could be benefiting, its brand could be benefiting from this, but instead people more senior than them in the Democratic Party publicly attack them and distance themselves and do the opposite of making the Democratic Party brand benefit from this, potential rebranding, to use branding language. But by branding, what I mean is like changing the politics of the Democratic Party to be in the corner of working people, because that's what Trump has done. It's bullshit, but he's managed to convey this narrative of, I'm a fighter and I'm in your corner. And because he's established that, a lot of his base give him a pass on all sorts of things that they disagree with, and all sorts of things that aren't congruent with that narrative. The Democratic Party has failed so far to establish that narrative of, I'm in your corner. They look elitist, and we need more Mamdanis, more Graham Plattners, and fortunately it looks like we're getting more of them, and that's the path. We have to organize. We have to talk with and win over and be in the corner of working people. And we have to name and confront the culprits at the top.